Good evening, all. Tonight we are talking about Alan Turing and the good life. So let's jump right in with Alan Turing. If you've never heard of this guy, he is worth a Google or two. He was a mathematician and a cryptographer that helped break the German Enigma code during World War II. So definitely worth looking into. Now, Turing is an interesting character just on his own, but well, let's look at it this way. Every time you pull up your iPad or your smartphone or even the computer that I'm working on, you're using Turing's thought, or you're using something about that. So much so that his influence seems to be ongoing even today. He was born in 1912 in Britain, and super smart guy, mostly an abstract thinker. At 19, he entered King's College in Cambridge and was elected a fellow of the college in 1935. And he proposed his Turing machine, which we're going to talk about shortly, in 1936. He received a doctorate from Princeton, where he studied logic and number theory. And during World War II, this was when he was involved in the team at Bletchley Park. They made a movie about it called The Imitation Game, starring Benedict Cumberbatch not too long ago, where he is breaking what is essentially an unbreakable code. Now, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society in 1951, was later arrested for homosexual activity, which was still illegal in Britain at this time, and committed suicide by cyanide in 1954, which is a shame because he could have done some really amazing stuff had he stayed around. Now think about breaking a code. Codes are essentially getting in someone else's mind, because as we make a code, maybe we do, say, the most simple replacement code, where 1 is A and 2 is B and so on and so forth. But when we make or break a code, we're really doing something fairly interesting. We're solving a problem, kind of working backwards through it. So in 1936, Turing published a paper called On Computable Numbers. Specifically, he was addressing something called the Entscheidung problem. It means a decision problem, basically. And he established that there's no single method to decide all mathematical questions. Okay, that's going to be important here. What he figures out, though, is going to be something that's the foundation for almost all modern computer science. A mathematical problem, and don't shut off yet, a mathematical problem is decidable when there's a problem-solving algorithm for it. So and we get scared at the word algorithm, but we really ought not to be. The most common algorithm we've got is arithmetic, okay? Think of it as a formula. It's a machine. If you put in the right input, you're gonna get out the right output, okay? And if you've got that machine, you're always going to get the right answer, provided it's properly applied. Now, any number of mathematical problems are what we would call undecidable. That is, no algorithm exists to directly solve them. So one example of this is Fermat's last theorem. Pierre de Fermat lived from 1601 to 1665, and he had his famous theorem is x to the n plus y to the n equals z to the n. Solve for n. Now, he did that in the 1650s, and it was not solved until 1994. And it was solved by a Professor Wiles, and the closest he could get is that n couldn't be any integer larger than 2. So some of these things take a long, long time. Now, Turing was not able to solve the most general algorithm problem. That is, one thing that would be a one-size-fits-all for everything. But he did succeed in developing an algorithm by which we can determine, is a problem computable? That is, can we find an answer for it? And he starts to think about this in terms of, in adding a long series, performing the same operation over and over and over again, as long as is necessary, is there a way by which we can determine something? Now, he posited a device that could be constructed in a way that would have an infinitely long strip of tape, like ticker tape, paper, okay? Some way to mark ones and zeros on it. And really, those numbers are arbitrary. It really doesn't matter what they are. They could just as easily be A's and B's, smiley faces and poop emojis. It really doesn't matter. We can take any problem of any degree of complexity, we reduce it down to 1 and 0 and or yes or no steps, and all of these are represented in what comes to be known as a binary system. So those of you that have any experience in coding, you know that we use binary to figure things out. Back in the golden days when we were taking attendance because we could actually attend class, I used a binary system. 1 if you're there, 0 if you're absent, and so on and so forth. Doing this can do those simple operations, but it can also solve infinitely large operations provided we can address ones and zeros to them, yes and no type things. So this is the Turing machine. It's an algorithm. It's not a machine as such that takes input signals and determines an output, okay? Think of a vending machine, okay? Same basic idea here. You put some quarters in the vending machine, maybe $1, well, these days definitely $1 or more, and you press the right combination of buttons and you're gonna get your Coke or your candy bar or whatever it is that you want. Now, a little kid might think there must be a person in the machine making these decisions, but there doesn't need to be. The problem is computable because it's input, output. Now, this particular machine instantiates the process is kind of irrelevant. Function is everything. If we think back briefly to William James, remember we tied his functionalism to just about everything, and that's what allowed his pragmatism, okay? What determines the type of activity is the algorithm that we instantiate then. Could be a pattern recognizing device that turns off water or turns off the fire alarm or whatever it might happen to be. Now we have to think though, is the human being a Turing machine? Is there anything significant about us as intelligent beings that differs from a really sufficiently powerful computational device? Okay. Now, forgive me, most philosophers are going to agree that what's unique to us is our ability to reason. We can solve problems, we can think abstractly, we can imagine things. An intelligent being is one that's able to perform a set of functions that we associate with intelligence. For example, creative problem solving. Turing addressed this in an essay entitled Computing Machinery and Intelligence, and he applies the Turing test. We put a person and a device behind curtains rather, and we address each of them with questions. So for instance, are all bachelors unmarried men? Well, if you know the definition, or if the computer's been programmed to know that definition, they're going to answer the same thing, which is, yes, they are. We might ask it a different question though. What is the best way to get from San Antonio to Austin? Now, this is one of those of, it's not immediately obvious. Do we mean the most direct route? Do we mean the most scenic route? Do we mean the route with the least traffic? Do we mean the route possibly with the most amenities available to us? And each of these is going to give us a slightly different option of which one might actually be preferable to us. So if the productions from one end of the curtain match up with well enough from the other, on what grounds would we say that the computer is an intelligent being beyond just prejudice not wanting it to be? So we get an if-then statement. If the proper definition of a rational, intelligent being is one who is able to perform certain computational operations to achieve certain ends by problem solving, then human beings are really just biological instantiations of something that can be instantiated non-biologically, by a computer, by an iPad, by a phone, what have you. Our problem of knowledge has just become a computational problem. Now, there's a problem with this Turing-like perspective on things, and Wittgenstein would probably be one of the first to point it out, is the symbols of the Turing machine, those ones and zeros, mean nothing in themselves, because meaning can only be agreed upon in a social context. Remember, the symbols are arbitrary. We could use A's and B's and so on and so forth. John Searle, a later philosopher, developed a comparable criticism. He called it his Chinese room test. So imagine that we've got a person who is completely ignorant of the Chinese language. They're alone in a closed room, and available to them are cards with Chinese ideograms on them, that's the symbols, and instructions in the language that they understand, and they follow which shapes to search and which ones to put next to others. So the person is constructing these Chinese sentences by these means, meaningless to himself, he can't understand them, but Chinese speakers waiting outside the room can understand. The question that Searle poses is, does the person know Chinese? Or does the room, given that it has the speaker, the ideograms, the instructions, does the room know Chinese? Searle thinks that the missing ingredient, and I'm inclined to agree with him, is intentionality, meaning itself. If it's not there, it's simply not there. If you were to go to Google Translate and ask it to translate something into a language with which you are familiar, and it translates it wrong, you have the opportunity to correct its translation. It gets smarter with every interaction, or rather it learns this is the correct ideogram to use for, or idiom to use for this particular thing. Now, way back in the beginning, the first lecture of our semester together, we talked about the Upanishads, the disciple sitting down next to the teacher in the forest of wisdom. And the teacher asks, when the sun is down, by what means do you see? The student answers, by the moon. And when the moon is dark, you see by the candle's light. And when the candle is out, the only remaining light is that light within, known but unseen. It's working towards this truth by means never found in that external world of flesh, blood, and dead matter. Alan Turing lived most of his life in this forest of wisdom, searching by his own inner light. Kind of like Pythagoras, he was looking for truth in the realm of symbols, not instantiated by any physical beings, only by relations and in an abstract manner. In part because of this search, our humanity is now understood not in biological terms, but in informational terms, perhaps as a little more than a set of computational operations. So with that, we turn to our question of what is the good life? That is, if you could have the best possible life, what would it look like? What principles would guide that? This is kind of the final lecture that we're going through on the big picture part of our project, of the long debate of problems of knowledge, of conduct, and of governance. And we want to figure out, what is this good life? Now, the theories of the good life usually boil down to about 4. I mean, and that really doesn't matter. It could be 4, it could be 44. You've got to at least implicitly accept an essentialist theory of human life. Okay, so the good life, for a certain form of life, is going to be what you make it. So the first identifiable perfect life that we're given in history of philosophy comes from Aristotle and his contemplative life. Remember, this is taking a page from that Socratic maxim that the unexamined life is not worth living. You've got to spend some time thinking about this. The same Aristotle, though, along with a whole legion of other philosophers, some Stoics, some medieval, are also going to give us the active life, which is lived, not just thought about, and that this is the right sort of life. There's also a fatalistic model of life. The good life is something that you're kind of lucky if you end up having any part of it. There's this series of inevitabilities. Somehow the future is already known at some level, and the most that we can do is really give it a good try, or our best. Key element of this fatalism is a resignation. If we think back to our Stoics, that apatheia, that not apathy, but a resignation, that is an essential property in the good life, that the good life is just coming to grips with these inevitabilities and being realistic about our chances. What about a hedonistic life? This is one we haven't touched on a whole lot. Remember, hedonists seek out pleasure, but the true hedonist isn't out just for any and every pleasure. The true hedonist wants to track that narrow path between pleasure and pain, never wanting pleasure so much that being deprived of it constitutes a pain, and never avoiding pain to such a degree or so assiduously that they miss out on any conceivable pleasure. The goal of a hedonistic life ultimately is tranquility. What about saints and heroes? Where do they fit in all of this? We think of saints as people who are engaged in what ethicists call supererogatory acts, which sounds dirty, but it isn't. It literally just means going above and beyond the call of duty. But saints and heroes usually don't think of themselves as that. If we see the saint or the hero, they say, it gives me joy, or it's just my job. The lives of saints and heroes don't seem to really conveniently match up with any of these schemes of the good life. They seem to be unique. They seem to be exemplary in some way. Think of how I could have lived my life if I were as good as that person, whether it be Saint Seraphim of Sarov or the hero fireman or whomever it happens to be. This has to do with how we think about ourselves and others, and how we want to be thought of by them. Pardon me. How we think about anything depends on brain activity and the programming we've gone through, life's experience, the cultures that mold us, and so forth. If all we know is just the result of conditioning history, the best life could be applied in Descartes' terms by an artificial stimulation of our brains, separated from our bodies, nourished in a vat somewhere. We could have pleasure, even be saints and heroes. Presumably, brain centers could be stimulated that would have us doing Fermat's last theorem. Even activities could be simulated. What one can dream of experiencing can be brought about by stimulating the brain. If this option were available, to have any life of your choosing played into you, on what grounds would you reasonably reject it? All students of philosophy should really address this question because it raises the possibility that the esteem of others, as well as ourselves, along with our experiences, may not be core to our desires of a good life. If we think back to Aristotle, specifically his notion of eudaimonia, remember happiness, completion, perfection, fulfillment, satisfaction, flourishing, and so forth, doing something for its own sake can be translated as all of those different things. If synthetically generated experiences aren't acceptable, then there must be something else. You may recall the story of Cleobus and Biton. Solon said that they were the happiest of men. This suggests that the good life might even be a life that we aren't aware of or know is good. Recall that Cleobus and Biton, they had pulled their mother to the temple of Hera so she can implore the goddess that her sons would die the happiest of men. They go outside, they fall asleep, and they never awaken. If Cleobus and Biton really derived eudaimonia from their virtuous deed, and they weren't conscious that they would be so remembered because they never woke up, then they may have been conscious of nothing more than the effort of the struggle to get mother to the temple on time. And yet Hera guaranteed they died the happiest of men. One of the lessons that comes back to us from the lives of saints and heroes is that a saintly or heroic life is not lived self-consciously. It's lived in a way that's conscious of others. Hallucination won't do. We don't want the sensation of having done it for others. We want to actually do this. This is why, though it makes little sense with my poor carpentry skills to go and build a house for Habitat for Humanity, I want to be the one hammering in that nail or doing whatever it happens to be, even if it's not the best use of my time there. It's certainly not the best use of their time, but we don't want the sensation of having done it. We want to actually go and do it. So how do we proceed? First off, we've got to determine what's in the best and most abiding interest of others. And the only way that we can do this is through a contemplative mode of life. We've got to think about it. But then there's the matter of getting out there and actually doing it. And nobody can do that except by what is finally an active form of life. But you don't have any promises in advance as to whether your actions are going to succeed or fail. What if you have the best of intentions and it turns out absolutely awfully? You have to adopt this kind of fatalistic position. You have to not be terribly concerned with that. And a great and exalting pleasure comes from enlarging the possibilities in the lives of others, so we have to meet the fundamental objectives of a hedonistic individual. Indeed, there must be great joy and pleasure in the life of a saint, or at least a deep sense of satisfaction for a hero, knowing that they've saved a life or lived a good life or so on. So this is kind of where we leave off on this portion. I mean, fundamentally, the only things that we really enjoy are serotonin and dopamine. This is the question of where do we find these things? How do we know where the best possible life is? And how do we make sure that we get it and that we live it? And that's all for today. I will see you next time. Bye-bye.